Hello. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name's Elisa. I'm the events coordinator here at Politics and Prose, where we now host in-person and virtual events, along with partnered events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything that we have confirmed, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I would like to ask you to please silence your cell phones just to avoid any disruptions during the event. While we've lifted the mask mandate here in the store, we do encourage mask wearing throughout the event. If you didn't bring one, we can provide one for you. Just let us know. When we get to the time for opening the floor to your questions, we've placed a microphone at the end of the aisle here by that big pillar. Please do line up at that microphone to ask your question, just so we can hear it in the recording of tonight's event and so it can be heard throughout the store. We are live streaming tonight so that you or anyone that you know can soon find the recording at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this big table, so if you haven't already purchased your book, we have plenty of copies up at our front registers. We'll ask you to line up starting at that same pillar by the microphone to get your books signed and personalized. So once you purchase your books, please have them out and ready for us so that we can get them set up to get signed. Once the event is complete, we ask that you please fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy like that long row of bookshelves over there, just to help us clean up a bit. So now without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome Rana Foroohar, celebrating the release of Homecoming, The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. Rana Foroohar is the author of Don't Be Evil, which won a Porchlight Business Book Award, and Makers and Takers. Currently the global business columnist and associate editor for the Financial Times and the global economic analyst for CNN, she has served as the assistant managing editor and economic columnist at Time and an economic and foreign affairs editor and foreign correspondent at Newsweek. She's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and sits on the board of the Open Market Institute. Foroohar will be joined in conversation with Sarah Bloom Raskin. Sarah Bloom Raskin, the former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Sarah is a former Federal Reserve Governor and former State Banking Commissioner for Maryland. She is currently the Colin Brown Distinguished Professor at Duke University Law School. She leads the Climate Finance Group at Kaya Advisory, which focuses on navigating the challenges of the climate transition. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Rana Foroohar and Sarah Bloom Raskin.
Thank you. Oh, hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. And what a treat.
Oh my God, I'm so humbled. Can I just say, I am totally starstruck to be here with Sarah. This is like the biggest honor ever to be interviewed by you.
No. Well, it's good to have the shoe on the other foot. You know? Because,
that's true, actually.
How many of us have been at the the incisive end of your questioning? So it's going to be good. But
okay.
I have to say, this book is just, first of all, an irresistible title. I mean,
thank you.
Great
Thank
title. You. And what we have in it is really this intertwining of different I see three kind of important strands in it. We have, the requisite, geopolitical, doctrine, and we have in it really the nuts and bolts of what is happening in our supply chains. And then sort of interspersed with these, two big themes is like real life stories. And what you've done in terms of going out into our country, into various places, into various pockets, and talking to different people. So I thought that what we would do is sort of explore each of those twines, so to speak. And let me say again what they are, just so people, have this sense. So on the geopolitical side, what we are seeing in Homecoming is a description, really, of the end of neoliberalism and a de-globalization, so an idea that things are coming home now. So I think that's kind of one really important aspect of what you've done here. And then you've explained this in the context of the supply chain, of this need to really develop more resilient supply chains. So I think the nuts and bolts of that would be also worth talking about. And then, of course, the stories. I mean, the stories are just what makes this book, I think, so unprecedented, that you could talk about, this high, like, geopolitical doctrine and bring it, into the, sort of towns of North Carolina.
I always want the stories. When you sell a book, the agent says, okay, great idea, but what about the stories? You know, because that's really what makes people read and keep reading, I think.
Yeah, and one thing I want to do, Rana, is because this is like a Washington, you're in a company town here. Some of the stories you tell are people who actually work on these issues as career experts in these fields. And there's one in particular I hope you get a chance to talk about, who, I mean, just the people are just extraordinary, but we have people in this town who work doing all of these things and are extraordinary. I mean, there's some extraordinary people in the background driving a lot of this.
100%. And I have to say, and I'm not just saying this because I'm in the company town, I'm not a Washington insider, really. I'm not a Politico, but I'm down here a lot, speaking to people like you, speaking to folks in the White House, all the usual suspects. I am just constantly blown away, and this is something I actually wanted to try and highlight in the book, and I try and highlight in my journalism, how hard people work in these jobs that are trying to figure all of these things. I mean, it makes me a little tearful because it's like, no, I think the average American person just doesn't understand how much you give when you take one of these jobs. I know you know that, but I wanted to get that across, and I'm glad it did come through.
It really did come through. So let's start first by just talking about sort of the why of the book, and then a little bit of the how. So, why this book and why now, and then how you did it.
Wow. Okay. Big questions to start. Thank you. First of all, thank you for all that, and thank you for reading so well and carefully. So let me start with why. I've been really privileged for the last 32 years to cover the global economy and sort of the political economy as part of that. I worked for a couple of news magazines, Newsweek and Time, as a foreign correspondent, and then I wrote a book called Makers and Takers, which was really kind of a post-game analysis of the financial crisis. And I started to talk to policymakers in the U.S. after that, and really started thinking deeply about what was broken in our economy. Why in the last 40 years we've created really unprecedented amounts of global growth, but there's huge in-country inequality, and we see that. We all see that around us. And I grew up in the rural Midwest. I grew up in Indiana, really in the middle of a cornfield. And I had kind of an interesting childhood. It influences the book a lot. My dad was an immigrant, came to study in the U.S., worked in manufacturing as an engineer in supply chains, actually the sort of components, parts that would serve Detroit. And then he eventually started his own small manufacturing business. And so I'm 52. My whole childhood was sort of living the policies of the 80s and 90s and seeing a lot of consolidation, seeing the destruction of family farms, and then seeing the total hollowing out of the industrial supply chain in the areas that we lived in. My dad lost his job when I was in college. My mother, who was a school teacher, had to take a second job to pay for it. So there was a felt experience, to use a term that is common now, that just as I traveled through the worlds that I was traveling through, and of the neoliberal world, the coastal elites, the global elites, and talking to folks that were making these policies, there were certain things that were never adding up to me, and it just didn't mirror my own felt experience of the downsides. And post-financial crisis, as some of the data began to come in on this, and people really dug in more deeply, both in reportage and I think in the national conversation about what's happening here. I mean, why do we have parts of the country that are so hollowed out? Why do we have deaths of despair? What's happening? I started just kind of pulling strands from my previous work, but always I find when you write a book, but also when you think about big topics, and I wonder if it's like this for you. I bet it is, knowing a little bit about how you think. There's a conversation, there's a moment that starts to kind of pull things together. And I had one of those moments actually in Washington when I was reporting my first book, Makers and Takers. I spoke to Richard Trumka, who's the now deceased, wonderful former head of the AFL-CIO. great labor leader. And I had spoken to him a lot over the years, spoke to him about the financial crisis, but I was asking him about trade. And we had a conversation which didn't make it into the first book, but was, really just, to me, kind of encapsulated my thinking on this book. And I said to him, what were the conversations that you were having with policymakers in the 90s, particularly about the trade deals that were being cut, NAFTA, the movement eventually of China into the WTO? These were going to be big changes. What was the conversation? And he said he remembered a policymaker from the Clinton administration coming to him and talking to him about this. And he said, this is really going to kill us. Labor is just going to be decimated. And this policymaker said, well, we know that, but don't worry, because eventually things are going to get better and wages are going to level out globally. That term leveling out is now a thing.
Yeah, and that's the long run, the long run.
Well, in the long run, we're all dead. So Trumka said, well, yeah, okay, we get that, but how long is it going to take? And the policymaker said, totally straight, according to him, 3 to 5 generations. And when he told me that, I wrote it. I'm not naming names here. I wrote that down in my notebook, and I went back at the end of the conversation. I said, did you say 3 to 5 generations? And he's like, yeah, that's what he said. And I thought about that for years, honestly, because I just thought, well, there it is. That's why, my town voted 76% Trump in the last election. It encapsulated a problem that kind of had no name yet, I think, and I started to tease that out throughout the course of the book. So as I explored, and I was particularly interested in this as a Democrat, coming from the left, I just felt like too many folks I knew on the left seemed like folks that should be on the right, or maybe an old-fashioned, I don't know what's right and left anymore, but they were definitely not thinking about working people in the way that I felt the party should be thinking about working people, and I wanted to understand that better. So as I learned more, I really kind of discovered how these neoliberal economic ideas, and by that I mean, I kind of define it the way the IMF does, which is neoliberalism as an economic idea that capital, goods, and people can travel across borders, and crucially that they will always land where it is most productive and best for them to do so, and that this will lift all boats. That idea had really made its way and trickled down, the trickle down part of that had made its way from the 80s into the 90s and was really deeply embedded now in democratic economic policy in ways that I think were not helping people, net the country, but also I felt were not helping the party. And that's another thing that I wanted to understand. So some of the stories I tell when I go around the country, and I looked at agriculture, I looked at the textile supply chains, I looked at technology. I asked people about their businesses and how they saw the economy of the country, but also their politics, and that was very illuminating. So maybe I'll stop there for a minute.
Yeah, yes, really, really fascinating. So tell us about, let's just do a little of the geopolitical stuff. So is neoliberalism dead?
Well, I said that in the book, that we are entering a post-neoliberal era. I've been trying to sell this idea hard. I had an op-ed in the Times on Sunday and a piece in the FT. I'm really, really pushing it. I think we are entering slowly a new era. We're maybe at the beginning of that era. And, if you look back deeply in history, pendulums always shift, right? And a philosophy, a political philosophy, is suited to its time until it's not. And so when I started looking in the kind of, the wonky parts of the book about, well, where did this neoliberal idea come from? And was it useful? Was it not useful? I was really fascinated by some of the things I learned, that the word had first been coined in the 30s in Europe, and it really came out of a period that in some ways is not dissimilar from our own, where lots of turmoil, Europeans between the two great wars. You had political philosophers and economists trying to think about how can we bring countries together? How can we tampen down nationalism, fascism? How can we basically connect the world and make sure we don't have more war? And so they came up with a philosophy that was really about connecting capital and business, and that worked for a long time. And then when it was sort of adopted in the guise of the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, you could even argue that there were, some good things that came out of that. Maybe there was too much regulation in parts, maybe global capital needed to be unleashed. But then I would argue that by the 80s going into the 90s, when that capital unleashing starts to go into the trade sphere, and you start to get goods being unleashed too, and particular globalized trade amongst countries that have fundamentally different political economies, then it starts to get really, really sticky. And so I think now we're beginning to see that. I mean, you can never time a book perfectly, but I have to say the news pegs of the last few weeks and months and days really have been kind of amazing. I always thought, frankly, having gone to China for 25 years, that there was going to be some level of decoupling. I just never, on multiple trips, would look around and say, wow, this is a country that is going to seamlessly come into the Washington consensus. Yeah, that's gonna work. I just thought, no, I mean, this is a complicated, rich country with its own system and its own culture. And I always felt that was being overlooked either benignly or not so benignly. I think in the most benign case, you could say that there was a hopeful sort of free trade will make us free sort of philosophy. On the more cynical side, and I know plenty of people like this, business people just wanting to get the next quarter of growth in China and not really caring, how are those products being made? What are the trade-offs in domestic policy and global trade policy? And so I think we are now having a conversation about that. And the fact that the word neoliberal is even appearing in papers is, I think, significant and sort of indicative of that change.
Yeah, and of course now we've had the pandemic, right? And the pandemic, it strikes me, and I think your book does a really good job of this, is really exposes the fragility, essentially, of a model in which we have had we've been highly dependent on supplies and components coming from different parts of the world. The idea, of course, being that there's mobility across borders, that capital can be allocated anywhere, and that technology has permitted us to essentially source components from anywhere in the world. Yes. And of course, then the pandemic hits, right? And we're faced with this, very critical shortages, a sense that we're actually at the whims of countries that are going to take care of their own people, of course, before ours, and we're highly dependent on other countries.
Yeah, no, it's that conversation about efficient versus resilient that I think people are having now. And I'll just share a couple of those stories from the books because, I think that they just resonate with everyone. So the pandemic hits, and, some of us have been thinking about supply chains for a long time. That's one of my geeky sort of pastimes, is thinking about things like that. And for my first book, just as a little precursor to the story, I had looked at supply chain fragility in the context of financialization. And by that, I mean the idea that you have to move cost downstream, you have to move it off the balance sheet, make everything cheaper, and that's Chicago school economic thinking. Cheap is good, share price is what matters, and companies, their share prices go up as they offset costs, as they send labor to cheaper countries, as they replace workers with technology, their share prices always go up. So I was looking, well, what are the fragilities in that? And at the time I was researching, there was a tragic but sort of perfect for the purposes of illuminating this example with the Rana Plaza factory disaster in Bangladesh, where you had this really highly financialized supply chain for garments that was, dozens of layers away from the corporate office decisions being taken. And these huge brands like H&M and Walmart had no idea that somewhere in Bangladesh there was a factory made with totally shoddy standards that was, the outsourcer for some outsourcer for another outsourcer. And they had no idea, and one day it collapses and kills, 1,100 people.
And firms don't always even know where their supply chain's coming from.
Know. And this is actually really this is a crucial national security issue now. Firms do not know, and I want to actually get back into that in a minute because I think we're at a massive pivot point on that. But so to go to the pandemic, pandemic hits, and then suddenly everybody's feeling the supply chain. It's funny about these, feelings and data. Economists are always talking about data. But the truth is that, and maybe everybody in politics knows this, nothing resonates until it's in somebody's felt experience. And so the pandemic hits, and we're all at home. Nobody's going to restaurants. We can't find food that we need in the grocery store. There are shortages of PPE. And supply chains break down. And so these highly concentrated, highly financialized, monopolized supply chains, and by monopoly, I mean either by a company or a country. So in the case of China, you mentioned, I think you were alluding to the story about masks. The masks that we all were wearing were mostly from China, made at a price of about 3 cents. Which PS is dumping, because even at the pandemic, not accounting for today's inflation, raw materials would force you to have a 5 or 6 cent mask. American masks were about 30 cents. So when China joined the WTO in 2001, everybody stopped making masks. There's like maybe 2 U.S. major mask makers still doing that business. But we did have a textile supply chain still in the Carolinas, and I started looking at that, and that became this fascinating study. It was almost like a Darwinian case study of what's the worst case scenario for an industry when this new trade paradigm comes in. Almost all garment work goes to Asia right away after 2001. But what is left is like a Harvard Business School case study of how you want to run a business. I mean, it's kind of the businesses the smaller and mid-sized businesses I grew up with in the Midwest, typically private, so they don't have pressure from the street, often family owned, often existing within kind of communal ecosystems where everybody knows everybody else. And it's almost Germanic. It's like this kind of competition collaboration paradigm. So these guys that own these textile supply companies get together, and nobody has masks, and they're like, well, we're not selling T-shirts, so let's make some masks. Well, they called up at the time Peter Navarro, who was Mr. Industrial Policy. I know I'm showing my political stripes. Am I allowed to do that?
Go for it,
okay.
Yeah.
And they didn't really have a plan. Nobody knew, what should be the process of rolling out this industrial policy to suddenly turn on a dime and make masks. So the folks in the supply chain and their industry group kind of worked together and came up with a plan. And what was really interesting to me from the point of view of, can we make things in America again? Guess what? Yes, we can, and we do. In 48 hours, they were making millions of masks. And I have been in the factories where this is happening. I have seen the workers. I have seen the machinery. I have seen how nimble it is. We can totally make things in this country. We've outsourced a lot, but it can come back. It is coming back. And some of it actually never left. The sort of mid-market never left. It was the more highly globalized, financialized companies that left. One final point on that I would say, I was fascinated by a conversation I had with some of the CEOs of these companies. Carolinas, particularly North Carolina, a red state that can swing blue, so, interesting politics. And a lot of the folks that I spoke with had voted for Trump, and they sometimes were, okay with that. Sometimes were, kind of held my nose and did this. But it was fascinating what they said. They would say, sometimes we vote Republican, sometimes we vote Democrat. We always vote on trade, because that's what matters. That's what, butters our bread. That's what keeps our communities afloat. And I thought, boy, that's really, really interesting. And so I'm kind of fascinated now to see the politics on the left and right converging in this area around trade.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. So on the supply, so a little bit on the supply chain, I'm wondering what you think about the notion that our supply chains are actually not really all up to the challenge of climate. So we've got, we're in the midst also of a climate crisis, and query as to whether there's a relationship between what we're experiencing, which is, of course, constant, right? Heat waves and droughts, and there was a really interesting report that came actually out of Europe. The Rhone River, it turns out, is like down to like a foot. So you can't actually get boats into the Rhone River, and it's an important choke point for transport. And so it raises the question of whether there's a relationship between the supply chain and what is happening from a climate perspective?
100%. 100%. A couple of actually all three industries that I looked at, agriculture, textiles, and technology, have huge carbon footprints. I mean, agriculture is, agriculture, textiles, fashion, and housing, I believe, are the top three. You might know better than me, but I believe that those are the top three in terms of carbon footprint. But here's an interesting thing. It's hard to get this data. Actually, it's hard to because I really wanted to be able to track the price of a T-shirt made in Xinjiang versus made in the Carolinas, and add in the price of the fuel and add in the carbon emissions. And that data is not so easy to come by, which is, there's multiple reasons for that. One of which is that, we stopped funding one of the departments, for example, at Commerce that actually collected that data. I'm a huge data person, by the way. We need like a whole data agency to basically connect the dots in the post-neoliberal era. But generalizing, yes. When you have these longer, more complex supply chains, by proxy, you have more emissions. Think about it. You're toting something through thousands of miles, on boats, it's packaging, all kinds of things like this. And then, of course, labor standards. I mean, we get into the broader conversation about ESG. But what was interesting, too, is when I was looking at textiles in a Made in America context, these companies are, of course, beholden to U.S. environmental standards, which are higher than almost every part of the world. And so you look at how business is being done in a factory in North Carolina, and it's quite fascinating and beautiful how every part of the cottonseed, every part of the product is being used for something. It's actually quite green and it's really nice to see, that the stuff that they're picking out of the cotton flowers actually gets sent downstream to someone's farm for feed, and there's just a lot of really interesting circular economy uses. Not the case when they're coming from somewhere in China or South Asia, and you just don't know a lot about it. So one of the things I'm really encouraged by, actually, is in the new climate. I shouldn't call it a climate bill, but Inflation Reduction Act. Sorry, it's been a long book launch already, and I'm forgetting my acronyms. Inflation Reduction Act is actually going to put some muscle on that. It's not quite the silver bullet, but let's say a price on carbon, which PS would knock out Chinese mercantilism like overnight, because you would just not be able to get anything into the country. But it will start to create some mechanisms where you can actually have a carrot and a stick, not just say we're going to keep out the bad stuff, but we're going to reward the people at home or in other countries that are doing the good stuff. And so I'm excited about that, and what a virtuous cycle you might have around industrial policy, a homecoming of quality jobs, and climate change.
So so you do a lot, I think, of really interesting work around this notion of resilience. And I think most of us, when we think of resilience, we think of individual resilience, not necessarily collective resilience. The individual, of course, being able to bounce back from adversity, or that notion of a personal strength. And of course, one of the things very much embedded in our American ethos is this idea that we pull ourselves up from the bootstraps, and it's an individual thing. And that's really not what you're talking about. Sometimes I think, we go a little far in this myth of individual resilience, and it keeps us from actually taking care of each other collectively. But that said, what I think you really draw out, Rana, you draw out this notion of collective resilience, and I think that ties into your sort of description of the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate provisions in it. But I wonder if you can say a little bit about what kind of nudges you think we need as a country that will, in essence, enhance our collective resilience, will harden our supply chains so that they can be resilient in the face of climate and other things. What do you, and there is in this book, by the way, a really, a wonderful ending, very uplifting, where you feel like, we can do this. This is all
optimistic about
within our power. But what are those nudges? What do we need here to actually, imagine and bring to reality what you think could be our future economy?
So that's a really good question. I'll start at the sort of really big picture level. I think we need a new narrative, and we're getting a new narrative. We had, the globalization narrative, the world is flat narrative, was never really true. Let's be honest. The whole McDonald's theory that countries with McDonald's were never going to go to war with each other kind of broke down when the former Yugoslavia fell apart. Clearly not the case now. We had a world. Our globalized world was based on cheap. It was based on cheap capital coming from the U.S. and cheap money in the form of monetary policy that was low rates, encouraging a lot of debt, lots of reasons for that. My whole first book was about that if you want to, geek out on that topic. But so cheap capital, cheap labor, mostly from Asia, and cheap energy, much of which was coming from Russia into Europe and fueling their sort of part of the globalization story. All those things are ending now. We're done with cheap money. We're done with cheap labor. And by the way, China is done with the old system too. One of the things I'm thinking about columnizing on is the fact that, a lot of people look
columnizing.
at columnizing.
That's a verb. That's a Rana word.
That's actually, that's what we say in the trade, columnizing. There's a narrative, and it's a narrative in the last few days. The president's getting a lot of flack for some of the export bans on dual-use chip technology. We have to understand that the U.S. is one actor in the story and not even, I would argue, the primary actor. We are reacting to a Chinese policy that has been put out in 5-year plans for some time. I mean, they're free to read. You can go online and check them out, and they never veer vectorally from them. China wants to be free of U.S. technology in the next few years. That's where the country's going. They actually, interestingly, in the most benign interpretation, which I hope ends up being the case, they want to have what's called a dual circulation technology, which is kind of a homecoming, actually. It's about, look, we used to be the factory of the world. Now we have wealthy enough consumers. Let's produce and consume in a more localized fashion to reduce emissions, to raise wages, to move to a kind of a more balanced regionalization. They wanted to do that anyway. Okay, so that's their plan. So the world is regionalizing, decoupling. It's a one world, two systems paradigm. However you want to put it. The old, world is flat thing is just done. So I think that's point number one, and we're getting the new narrative. Point number two is you do have to make things. I mean, I grew up in factories. I grew up in the Midwest, so I have, probably a prejudice towards this. But I just simply, when economists of whatever persuasion say there's a fetishization around manufacturing, I just completely disagree with it at a kind of a practical business level, because I know how innovation happens, and I talk to the CEOs and I talk to the business people who are innovating. It happens iteratively. Elon Musk, you may or may not like Elon Musk, but he's a classic example of an innovator that said, you know what? The more complicated my products get, the more I want to have my supply chain locally, because there are economies of scale here, and there is knowledge to be gained when people of all different stripes work together, the research team, the sales team, the labor, the value of labor, which is it's something that we don't think about enough in this country. But again, having an engineer dad who actually made me, when Japan was going to take over the world in the 80s, he made me go with him at night to Purdue University, which was like 20 minutes from where we lived, and take Japanese lessons. He was like convinced. But the Japanese Germanic model of all work has value, and every person within the process has value, and that value is adding and iterating and pushing innovation forward.
I noticed in the book you're actually not anti-automation.
No, not at all. I mean, in fact, the only way you go up the food chain is by using more technology, but you have to bring labor along with that. And it can actually be a terrific win-win, because if you look at a lot of factory jobs today, they're really high level. I mean, there's software training. It's almost like you're, I think they're kind of cool, fun jobs, because you're not sitting at a desk in a cubicle. You're actually making something, but you're working a lot with technology. You're working with systems thought. Anyway, I could go on about that. But so making things matters. And then other nudges, I think, connecting the dots, industrial policy, industrial strategy, they call it sometimes. Industrial policy is, I guess, still a little bit of a third rail word, but I hope not for much longer, because guess what? It's super American. Alexander Hamilton did it. The Chinese actually took his playbook. Like, that's why they're doing so well. We did it until, pretty recently. It's every country does it. The free markets don't think about public goods in the same way as government does. And you need labor, you need the public sector, you need the private sector working together for innovation, I think.
Yeah. We should open this up really for questions. I have more, but let's hear what's on people's minds.
I hope I wasn't too political.
Yes.
No, you weren't too political. That was a wonderful talk. And I remember when I think you came here and you did Makers and Takers.
I did,
and I was
yeah.
here for that.
Oh, thank you.
I'm 2 generations ahead of you. I was born not long after World War II. And you go from the 80s. The way things worked before that involved labor. There was the Gilded Age, and then there was the New Deal. And the New Deal was to get labor into the process, and not just as equipment manufacturing things. The reason those manufacturing jobs are always said to be good is because they were union jobs. And part of the profit of Ford and American Motors, George Romney, part of the profits were going to the unions in the form of wages, so that workers were getting paid good wages instead of government handouts. And in the 70s, when Milton Friedman published his article, all the things that companies and labor did together so that we could show the Soviet Union in the Cold War that workers here could, on one job, have a house, a car.
That's totally true, yeah.
And that has to be part of
100%,
what's coming,
yes.
And communities have to be part of that. One story, I needed to get my dryer fixed. It was a Korean LG, and I bought it locally. And but LG, there's no service for that. I called up and I got somebody who was repeating, but it had nothing to do with my dryer. So I looked in Google for a local company to fix my dryer. And I found local numbers, 301 numbers. And it turns out the companies were here, but all this was routed through California, like Amazon.
Well, it's funny that you say that. One of the stories, I'll just add and
Sure.
amplify what you're saying. One of the stories in my book, when I looked at agriculture, and agriculture was another part of the economy that I think was very much revealed during the pandemic, some of the fragilities and problems. So, you get terrible conditions in these meat packing factories. You get highly concentrated
Right.
supply chains. And I spoke to some farmers in Missouri, small and mid-sized farmers, that could not take their own hogs and their own food and take it 6 miles down the road and
Right.
sell it directly to a school or to a hospital, because there were so many layers of financial middlemen in between. And this middleman economy, which Kate Judge at Columbia has written, she has a great
Right.
book called The Middleman Economy. That's part of this as well. So it gets to that community thing that you're talking about.
And without it, you go to the depths of despair.
True enough. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. I can't wait to read the book. That was a wonderful talk. So my question is, if we are entering this new post-neoliberal era, do you view that from a national security perspective as a more dangerous era or a safer one? And I ask that question as we obviously see Russia using the interconnectedness of energy markets as a weapon. On the other hand, we haven't had a World War III, right, which is held up as one of the reasons we have this financial economic system in place.
I'm looking at some of the DoD people in the audience that may have their own thoughts about this, but I don't want to pretend like there's not going to be bumps and challenges in the new era. But I guess one thing I do feel good about is that there's no longer a sense of willful blindness, because I just used to go to China. I went to China all the time for a while because I thought, I got to figure out what's going on here. And I would just show up and think, oh my God, like they're thinking for the long term. We are thinking for the quarter. There is absolutely no understanding of what would happen if this relationship went badly. And interestingly, I in the bio that they kindly announced when we came in, I sit on the board of the Open Markets Institute, and Barry Lynn, who you probably know, who heads up that, did a wonderful book called The End of the Line, which actually came out the same year that The World is Flat came out. And I wish everybody would have read Barry's book because it just was so prescient on supply chain fragilities. I was speaking with Barry and a man named Chris Gopal, who's a supply chain expert, about this very topic of like, okay, what are the risks right now? And he was saying, when Ukraine happened, there were about 5 serious supply chains that got interrupted. If there were to be, let's say, a blockade of Taiwan or really like a hot conflict around that, there would be thousands. So is it worrisome? Yes. Is it good that we're actually starting to think about this now and get a plan? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think about a lot of the tools that we now use in as economic wartime tools, which are sanctions, right? And you can imagine we see how sanctions have been used with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I think it would be just sort of exponentially increased were China to invade Taiwan, and then the effect on the economy. I mean, for companies that are dependent on supply coming from China,
so
it would be.
You're thinking of this with your your Fed risk hat on, and that's so interesting because you're absolutely right. It would trickle immediately into the financial markets and then into pensioners' lives and into our politics. And
yeah. So again, I think that's one of the to the person who asked the question. I think that there are national security implications for sure.
No, 100% there are. And I mean, in fact, Barry and I just did a virtual event in Europe where we were kind of like, okay, what's the day 1 plan? What's the day 2 plan? Do we even know where things are? And the answer is not completely. We're getting there. We have lists, but no, and companies don't even know. That goes back to that factory collapse. They don't even know what's on their balance. It's just like the financial crisis. They didn't know what was on their balance sheets then and it exploded, and they don't know what's on these balance sheets either. In fact, there's a guy named, just to totally geek out, but you're my people, there's a guy named Zoltan Poznar at Credit Suisse who was one of the seers, really, of the kind of dominoes in the financial crisis. He's starting to do a lot of work around what are the dominoes in supply chain collapse, and he uses very similar language, and it's like inventory is the new liquidity, So anyway, sorry.
Hi, Rana. Can you speak a bit about the role of entrepreneurship in the post-neoliberal era? And part of the narrative of neoliberalism is a focus on large companies and the financialization of large companies that can move goods across borders. But there hasn't really been much talk around new enterprise creation or the process of growing businesses as part of public discussion. Could you talk a bit about that and how it's been talked about in some of your travels?
Totally. Hugely important. And I'm actually, this is one of the things I'm really hopeful about. Already small caps with a domestic focus, small capitalization companies, smaller companies with a domestic focus are outperforming the S&P 500 by double. And that reflects this shift that we are going through. There's another very good book, interestingly written by the head of McKinsey North America. When McKinsey starts saying it's a post-neoliberal world, the pendulum has really shifted. This gentleman just wrote a very good book called The Titanium Economy, looking at this kind of hidden strength that still does exist amongst smaller and mid-sized firms, and encouraging that and making sure that these firms are not the targets of predatory takeovers, for example. That's one of the things I'm worried about, because guess what? Private equity is starting to look at these companies now, and we need to make sure that they don't get fleeced.
But this is the role of antitrust policy.
This is the role of antitrust, and also financial regulation, because I still think that the shadow banking has not been properly regulated, and the reason that you saw Blackstone becoming the biggest owner of single family houses is because they didn't have the same rules that J.P. Morgan had. Different book, perhaps different lecture, but. I think that encouraging small businesses and encouraging diversity with antitrust, with, Barry talks a lot about the rule of four, making sure that you've got four geographies, four companies, in any given strategic sector is important. I also think that there is going to be a natural, as we start to get this decoupling, and you start to see within literally 48 hours the chip supply chains changing, that is going to start to support, I think, more localized ecosystems. I haven't looked, frankly enough, at the details of policy about how best to support small and mid-sized businesses, and maybe you have ideas about that, but I feel like that's another area where the times are changing.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Sarah and Rana. Rana, I really enjoy your swamp notes with Ed.
Oh, thank you.
My question is about, and Sarah alluded to this with her question about the Rhone River and climate, and you kind of mentioned ESG. So kind of this end of the Milton Friedman, companies maximize profit, shareholder capitalism, the rise of stakeholder capitalism, and how you think ESG is threaded in to the supply chain issues.
Yeah, so that kind of goes to the is cheap really cheap question. And no, of course it's not cheap. And we all kind of know that when you're getting a t-shirt that is $5, whose tiny fingers are making that and in which country, and, what are the conditions in the factory? I mean, we know this intuitively, but I think change happens when you start to see it and when companies have to pay the cost for that. And so that's why I like the Inflation Reduction Act and how some of the border adjustment, mechanisms as they get sorted out might work. I also think that ultimately I could imagine, and I sort of see the dots getting connected, like the SEC, for example, starting to really think about what the metrics are for, okay, if share price isn't the only thing that matters, what else does matter? And how might you measure that? And how might that be displayed on a company's a quarterly earnings report? And ultimately, I could imagine us getting sooner rather than later to a place where you have an almost like a nutritional label on products where you can see and feel that. And I think that the millennial generation is very much driving this, both as workers but also as consumers. They're just so on to the cheap is not cheap thing. I think about my daughter and her, who's 20, and in high school she spent a lot of time out marching against fast fashion, things like that. So I think we're getting there.
Hi.
Oh my gosh, hello.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming here to share your thoughts with us. My question is about the energy transition. Many argue that to successfully slow down climate change will require a global effort to push forward a global energy transition. From your perspective, the trend towards the regionalization of the world economy, how would that affect the whole energy transition?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one I get a lot. To be honest, even if we were living in a kind of a one world globalized paradigm, there was not regional agreement on how to move forward with addressing climate change. I mean, China has its own policies, Europe has its policies, and I think now that the U.S. Has its policies, we're going to see some action here too. I kind of think, let a thousand flowers bloom on this one, and I think that in my ideal world, I guess I'm still with Janet Yellen on this one, I would just love to see a single price on carbon because it's just so clean, no pun intended. It's just like, you just would be able to knock out right away so many trade issues, so many foreign policy issues, but that's not going to happen. So I see regional solutions eventually sort of, pushing things in the right direction. At least that's my hope.
Yeah.
What
really
do you think, actually?
No, I would just say
Sarah?
it's fascinating and of course really timely, because of course we see really I think a lot of the climate change discussions have morphed into really discussions of energy security, right? And in Europe in particular, I mean the dependence, of course, on the fact that they've got there's this autocrat named Putin who's actually making their lives miserable from a security perspective. Prices of energy and heating bills are going through the roof there in a way that they're not here for various reasons. But the notion really of being dependent for energy on countries that have, are really not friends of ours, really underscores this imperative that we really have to do better. And I think it fits into Rana's theme of, of localization. We need to be more independent. I mean, we can't be dependent on these countries for our needs in a lot of ways.
That's a strength. I mean, I think that's an area that the U.S. really has a traditional strength. I mean, decentralization, ideas coming from lots of different places, innovation coming from individual entrepreneurs, individual researchers. That's something that the U.S. has going for it, I think, in this.
Yeah, I mean, but one thing that we, that pushes against that, of course, is this notion of scale. And the prior question had to do with entrepreneurship, right? I mean, the economists teach us that, we have to have scale. You have to have big companies, because that's actually how you derive strength. That's how you get your scale benefits. Yeah. And, so I think there's a lot of work that would need to get done to kind of shift into a frame where, yes, we value entrepreneurship, but we always value it because you say one day one of these companies will get really big. They'll be the next, Google or the next Walmart or, the next Amazon. That's the way we look at it. And I think you're presenting a different frame.
Yeah, totally different frame. And you have to start connecting the dots in really different ways, which is part of this, that's the national security issue, I think, right now, is we don't really understand fully weaponized networks and how they can be used. I mean, you mentioned sanctions, and we saw sort of how the dollar could be weaponized, and that's interesting. But when you kind of start to look back at, well, how did Germany get in such a ridiculous position vis-a-vis Russia with energy? Well, putting I'm tired from, but putting what's his name on the board of Rosneft, the German former German yeah, exactly. Was part of that, and that's kind of a strategic weaponized network thinking that America needs to get up to speed with, I think.
Hi, first, thank you both for your extraordinary courage and commitment in taking on these issues and forcing all of us to think about them, and for being here. So thank you very much. I hear what you're saying, and I wonder what your thoughts are on the impact for emerging markets like Bangladesh, yes, if the world becomes more local rather than global.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think a lot about not just emerging markets, but smaller countries in general, because working for the FT, a lot of my colleagues actually are quite anxious about this new world, because they look at the U.S. and they look at China and they think, okay, U.S. in particular, food, fuel, consumer demand, you can kind of tough it out and figure this out. China can get there via mercantilism and its own pathways, but where is Europe and where are emerging markets? Well, particularly in South Asia, I think emerging markets are in a very tight spot, and it's going to be a bumpy time, but also a time for, I think, the U.S. to start reasserting values-based economic statecraft. I like, for example, the new trade discussions in Asia, and the coalition building that's going on with Catherine Tai and Gina Raimondo, kind of trying to create a new Asian trade pathway for the U.S. That labor is at the heart of it, that ESG is at the heart of it, and so there's a values message that, hey, we're not just in this for your cheap labor and your raw materials, and we're not going to load you down with debt that then maybe is going to go bad, as it is going bad now in China, and you're going to get stuck having to pay for that. This is an opportunity, but I think we really have to walk the walk, and we have to get it right, in this country, and then get it right in those countries as well. And it's also an interesting moment, because I think that there's going to be the potential for both a tremendous win as we shift to the digital economy, but also I'm very worried that we could be in for some of this like race to the bottom, white collar outsourcing in the digital economy, because I was at a meeting of CEOs about a year ago, and we were talking about the work from home trend. And one CEO said, people don't realize, they're so excited about work from home, but if you can do it in Tahoe, you can do it in Bangalore. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Okay. Where's that going? So anyway, I think but I think the importance of asserting what are the values, what kind of capitalism do we want to have, what kind of market society do we want to have, and how much efficiency pressure can we all take? Not much more, I don't think.
I think your question too is really, really prescient, given that given the particular strains that emerging market economies are under right now. One, interest rates being ratcheted up at a very fast rate. So you have, we are a dollar-denominated world, so you've got fleeing of capital
Huge
from
food insecurity.
from these countries, right? Food insecurity, and of course climate. I mean, they are still bearing the costs of the high emission countries having done, horrible things to their countries, right? So,
All right, thank you.
Well, it's good to see you. And I wanted to
Oh,
say
what a
that
treat.
for me, this session has been an exercise in psychotherapy, because you have been expressing so beautifully things that I have felt, and as you know, have been working on for a long time. But I do think that dating this at the beginning of the WTO and so forth overlooks the fact that the origins go back at least to the start of the Reagan administration, when Sarah and I were in the trenches throwing Molotov cocktails at the advancing tanks of the neoliberal revolution at that moment. And the elephant in the room is the financial sector. It's the dominance of the dollar. It is what the Federal Reserve, as you just said, is now doing, raising interest rates. To do what? It's obviously not going to help make it possible for American industry to revive, because it makes us less competitive, other people more so. And so what do you do? Are you having any success, in other words, in converting the establishment at the Financial Times? And can we look forward to maybe rechristening it the Industrial Times sometime soon?
Oh my gosh.
Much.
I am having such a hard time. Thank you for that. Yeah, I have to tread a fine line, because pushing it and not getting fired, it's like too. The FT is actually, interestingly, and I'm really glad that you brought us back to the 80s. I felt like I dealt with the 80s a lot in my first book, and I really wanted to dig into trade, and trade action happened a little more in the 90s, so that's why I'm focusing more on that. But you're totally right. At the end of the day, companies are doing what the financial markets are incentivizing them to do. And that's why we have a huge debt bubble, right? And so financial reform is definitely a part of this. I'm trying to think what else I would say. I mean, I do think that the disaster that is Trussonomics is kind of, perhaps a marker here. Guess what? If you cut taxes on the wealthy and want to spend more, markets don't like it. Do you think, is that maybe the death knell for
that was
down?
really something for people who didn't quite follow this. In the last, I think it was maybe just 2 weeks ago, the new UK government, the Tory government, announced what they called a mini budget, where they essentially, slashed, indicated that they were going to slash government spending and decrease taxes for the absolute top of the income spectrum. And they did it without any review, any discipline. They didn't, it wasn't scored the way things get scored here. It was just sort of thrown in the mix, and it actually triggered, it sort of was the catalyst for some pension funds in the UK, which were using these sort of liability-driven strategies as sort of a derivative kind of response to controlling things. And the pension funds just, essentially started moving into a kind of death spiral. Yeah. And I think, I have a sense too that the large international banks were feeling these same kind of collateral calls, these margin calls. Anyway, it was an example really of how we are in the midst in our world really of so much happening, so many policies and interactions all at the same time. We've got, we have what Putin is doing to Ukraine. We have, all the central banks really raising interest rates at a very, very hefty pace. We have a heavy sanction regime. There's a lot going on, and this, and then on top of it, we are, we're starting to see fragility. And I think so anything can happen is kind of how I took from that UK incident.
My colleague Mohammed El-Arian, who is used to run PIMCO, the world's largest bond trader, who's now at Cambridge University and writes the FT, said he calls it little fires everywhere. That there's just, it's not one big Lehman Brothers moment yet, but there's just all this risk that's starting to bubble up in different sectors, and I expect there's going to be more of it. I'm a little worried about volatility in the treasury markets. Not to get into financial prognostications at the book reading, but if I had to look at where you might see trouble next, I would say private equity, housing, and the T-bill market. That's what I'm looking at. How about that? That was like a CNBC moment. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Rana and Sarah, for being here tonight. Let's give them a round of applause.